Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's 4 p.m. here in Rome. My name is Francesco Galietti. I'm your host today, and here with me is another Francesco Sisci, who is a highly respected China expert who divides his time between China, mainland China, and Italy, where he was born and raised. Of course, the voting has begun. It's a Saturday. An hour and a half ago, the polls opened. EU elections are on. And soon, in 48 hours, we will be inundated by a deluge of commentaries about various facets of EU elections. We do not want to bother you with comments on how many seats each party has got in this election. So what we decided to do is to have a frank conversation, no holds bar on what we consider the big issues of EU elections. It's going to be a geopolitical and geoeconomic conversation. My feeling is, just to kick it off a little bit, to break the ice, Francesco, my feeling is that Ursula von der Leyen's 2019 commencement speech, when she said she wanted a more geopolitical Europe, is sort of coming through these days. I mean, nothing or not much happened in the early stages of past EU nomenclature. But of course, in the meantime, we've had all sorts of events. We had, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We had lots of frictions between the US and China and the EU and China. And so I guess what we see these days is lots of headwind, economic headwind and political headwind. And I'll hand it over to you immediately, Francesco. Do you share this view, or is there anything you want to add at this point?
Yes, I agree with you. There is a lot of headwind. And also, I think there is a different set of priorities for the EU. That is, last time the European Parliament was elected, it was only about economics, and mainly about domestic economics, so to speak, within the EU. I mean, balancing different GDP and different trade deficits and internal deficits of different countries. Now it is economics and it is politics. And in the case of China, the two are mixed, because China is politics and is economics. It's economics for about trade, as you mentioned. Will Europe consider trade barriers of some way, tariffs of some way or another against Chinese imports? I think we see the trend there, but also about politics, because in a way, a different attitude between the EU and China about war in Ukraine has created a gap of understanding and I would say sense and sensibility between the two ends of this Eurasian continent. The second issue is, of course, I would say Russia. And Russia is something that is about a concern for every country in Europe. Every country in Europe is concerned, but the differences are massive. There are quite a few countries with a great influence, with a great Russian influence inside. And Italy is a specific case, I would say, because it is the one country where not one single party is specifically pro-Russian, so to speak, but Russia has a pervasive influence all over the political spectrum. And in fact, we had, shortly before the ballots opened, a very weird and bizarre statement by Russian President Vladimir Putin, claiming that Italy was close to his heart and they had special relations with Moscow. So we shall see, I think. What is your take?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I guess the two big elephants in the room remain China and Russia. In a way, it's the same dichotomy as before, like we face economic and geopolitical challenges, and China and Russia coincide with those. Based on that, I fear, I mean, both of us, of course, are Italian. And I fear that Italy here comes in as the weak link in Europe. It's like in 2022, when we had the general elections in Italy, we were presented with a fairy tale that we would have a right-wing government that would be staunchly Atlanticist. And we were also told that Giorgia Meloni would more or less step into the shoes of Mario Draghi. Draghi, of course, is a staunch Atlanticist. In the case of Meloni, well, it's a different story. Meloni herself is trying very hard to be credible as Atlanticist, but she, of course, has to deal with a coalition where, as you say, you have lots of friends of Russia and China, and even her own party. Her own party is not necessarily the most Anglo-friendly I can think of. And so, of course, if you fast forward and to 2024, we're now 2 years into Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's lots of fatigue. Meloni is a political operator. Like all political operators, she is dissecting all polls and surveys, and she's competing against Matteo Salvini, who's of course a Moscow poodle, and she does not want to lose votes to Salvini. And so we have a very odd competition, Meloni versus Salvini, basically competing for the same voters, many of which are Russia-friendly. So I'm afraid that this dogma of Meloni means Atlanticism, I don't know how much is left of that, okay? And then, of course, the other big item is, well, if Putin says that Italy is, from his perspective, is better than other countries, well, then it means we have a serious issue. We knew that, by the way. Italy had the largest communist party in the West for many years, and many of those communists are still around, still alive, in good health, and they certainly have not moved on to different positions. If they have to choose, they choose Moscow. We have lots of Catholic traditionalists who see Putin as their big protector in a world dominated by wokeism. So there are various reasons why Putin believes that he's better off in Italy than in other countries. But the big issue, of course, is Italy is a part of the core of Europe. It's a founding member of Europe. It's a NATO member. It's a Western European country. It's not Greece. It's not Bulgaria. We're not in the Balkans. I mean, we're Western European. So we have a huge issue there, and Putin is reminding us of that. And again, and then if you triangulate all that against Meloni's own position, competing for votes on the extreme right, okay, like she's not pivoted to the center, not at all. All these months in power, she could have moved inch closer to the center. That's not what she chose to do. And so again, I am afraid that if this is where we start, if this is where we come from, Italy will be the weak link in Europe, and that's something to watch very closely.
Yeah, just 2 points to add to what you just said. I agree totally, but about Atlanticism, my impression coming somehow from outside of Italy is that Italian Atlanticism and this government Atlanticism is a matter not of conviction, but of opportunity. That is, they understood, the present government understood that you had to be pro-NATO to be in government, so they toed the line. But by doing that and not understanding what Atlanticism is about, they always fall here and there. They don't understand what to do, what exactly not to do. And it is opening all kinds of opportunities to influences from other countries and from Russia. Well, why don't we have to talk to Russia? Why don't we have to talk to China? Yes, you have to talk to Russia. Yes, you have. You must talk to China especially. But how you talk it, where you draw a line, this seems to be very unclear.
You're right. And there's lots of neophytism. So, like, I mean, you're right. One of the reasons why Italy's Atlanticism is weird is that probably there is no idea of what the orthodoxy is and how much you can and when you can diverge from the orthodoxy. But there's lots of that's certainly the case. But then Meloni
maybe if I
please.
Yeah, just another point. And another point is that, in a way, Putin caters to the neo-fascists of the extreme right of Europe. We see Le Pen, we see Vox, that we see in Germany, Alternative for Deutschland. That is, in a way, quite magically, Putin is able to talk and convince people deeply, both in the right and in the left. And his argument against wokeism, but is more than anti-wokeism, is against Islam, against immigrants, against everything new. That creates a huge ideological, cultural vacuum that these guys, being culturally, I would say, on the right, can have a much easier life relating to Putin's talk than to American talk, which is extremely divided. Atlanticism, what it is, why are we at the end of the day for Ukraine and against Russia, is very vague, whereas Putin talks to everybody who is anti-American from the left, but also anti-American from the right. So here there is a lot of work, cultural work, that should be done in Italy, has not been done, is not existing, and that is the real matter. Why I think Russia can seep deeply into Italy. And through Italy, it can seep all through Europe if we are not careful, if we don't start a serious cultural work there. Sorry.
That's correct. And I share your view. There is a drag. Like Putin is a magnet, and he is catering to an audience that Meloni is courting. And so inevitably, even Meloni, who is a follower, she follows her voters, which is dragged into that. It's a vortex. So it's very dangerous. Let's move to China for a couple of minutes. Of course, with China it's different. Unless China invades Taiwan in the short term, we're in a different situation. We are the EU, which seems to have a life of its own when it comes to China. Like, the position of Brussels is different from the position of individual member states. Categorizes China as a partner, as a competitor, and sometimes even as a mortal enemy. Okay, like, depending on topics and circumstances, the EU has a different approach. That's what it is. Complicated, but it is what it is. And I would say that we are in a very strange place these days, because, like, if you look at the China-US relation, and even if you look at US presidential elections, what Trump and Biden seem to have in common is a fable for tariffs. Okay, like tariffs like up to 100% on imports from China, and like the European Commission is slowly getting there with a different, I mean, not as harsh as the US. Tariffs will probably not be as high, but still there seems to be a will to impose tariffs on certain products from China, electric vehicles in particular. So we need to see how big these tariffs will be. And then at the same time, individual member states are reaching out to China, trying to court EV producers from China, BYD and others, to set up factories in the EU. Like France is courting Chinese car makers. Spain has already moved to the fore. Even Italy is, I mean, reportedly, Italian authorities are having meetings with the Chinese EV producers. I don't know how consistent this is, like imposing tariffs on one hand and courting Chinese EV producers on the other. It can be consistent if your ultimate goal is to bring to Europe technologies which are absent these days in Europe. Because one of the big lessons learned during COVID, that there are entire pieces of supply chains, of value chains, which are no longer in Europe and are badly needed. Okay, so that's a type of strategic reasoning that France seems to have. Italy seems to be very chaotic. There seems to be no strategic thinking. But again, it may be myself here. I may be biased or too strongly opinionated. I'm very curious to hear from you.
Well, I agree with you. Europe is in utter confusion here. Now, I would say that about China, we can have generally 4 sets of policies, depending on where you are. The US, there is a, I would say, fairly united and unified China approach. Of course, many differences in the details, but I would say there is a main drive, both with Republicans and Democrats, that will go on and is the one unifying policy in the US. Then there is an Asian approach to China. That is the Chinese neighbors like Japan, India, Vietnam, Philippines, extremely worried about politically, militarily assertive China, but at the same time willing to keep some trade doors, trade gates open, also because the situation is different. Then there are the developing countries who have an interest in having a deal open with China. Lastly, fourth, there is the EU, which, as you said, doesn't really know what to do and doesn't really have a specific policy. It goes from one end to another, extremely anti-China on human rights, on principles, but then when it comes down to practicalities, they seem open to anything. On the issues of cooperation, and especially electric vehicles, one key element which is not clear to me at all is technological transfers. That is, are these potential factories, Chinese factories, to be set in Europe, willing to transfer technology in Europe, as in the past European countries transferred technology in China? I don't know. This is a very important issue to pursue, because if Chinese are open to have technological transfer, that would be very important in a climate that is driving everybody towards a second Cold War. There could be an opening. There could be, I would say, something to discuss. If it is just moving the factory to Europe to circumvent tariffs, well, I don't think that in the long term this could be tenable, especially since Chinese companies have stocks in some of the major German manufacturers. German manufacturers, European manufacturers, car manufacturers do not have 100% property rights on their Chinese operations. So there is big imbalance to be bridged. So I don't know, but what I see is the confusion. And I would say that Europe needs a greater clarity about China, because I would say Russia, of course, is important. There is a war right at our front gates. But the big long-term issue for Europe and for the world is handling China. And here we need a lot of wisdom.
Yes. And just to conclude on this, Italy has a very erratic pattern, because Meloni opted out of the BRI agreement with China on one hand, but on the other hand, when it had a chance to kick out Chinese state investors from Italian sensitive assets, so strategic networks, electricity grid and gas distribution grid, so Terna, Italgas, and Snam, it did nothing. Okay. And then again we had other episodes which involve private parties like Pirelli, where the CEO of Pirelli was able to maneuver the Chinese shareholders with the help of Italian authorities. But again, it's completely different than strategic networks and grids, and maybe we can keep that as a topic for our next chat. Francesco, thank you so much for this, and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.